Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Julia Cutler, and I want to take a minute to say thank you for taking the time to be with us. I'm joined here today with Dorie Clark, who's here to talk about how to be a long-term thinker in a short-term world. Welcome, Dorie.
Julia, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here and talking to so many wonderful alumni.
Great. I'll give some quick housekeeping information for our audience and then tell you a little bit more about Dorie. There'll be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so throughout the presentation, please click the Ask a Question button, which you can find right below the video. There are also resources below the video where you can find a link to Dorie's book. Now, to properly introduce Dorie, author of the best-selling book, The Long Game, How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World, Dorie Clark has been described by the New York Times as an expert at self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. Dorie has been named one of the top 50 business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50 and was honored as the #1 communication coach in the world at the Marshall Goldsmith Coaching Awards. She is also the author of several other award-winning books. She's a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review and consults and speaks for clients such as Google, Yale University, and the World Bank. Welcome, Dorie, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here. And today we are talking about a topic that has been on my mind for quite a while. It's the topic of my new book. It's called The Long Game, as Julia mentioned. The subtitle is How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World. And I think a lot of us are uh, beginning to see the necessity of this after COVID. We have been in short-term mode for so long that now I believe is the time for us to actually flip the switch and start to take back our autonomy and to really put a stake in the ground, because you can only be in reactive mode for so long. Now is the time to begin to come back to set forward looking goals and intentions. Because the truth is, even if there will be detours, even if unexpected challenges will arise, which of course is always the way, we need to have a direction that we're moving toward. That's how we make progress. That's how we actually are able to accomplish the goals and what we care about in our lives and in our careers. So I'm going to start the screen share right now and dive into the presentation. We're going to be taking questions as well at the end of the presentation. So at any point, if something comes up, if you have a question or if something strikes your fancy or there's a comment, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and Julia will be my wonderful interlocutor at the end. And I look forward to addressing all of that. So let's go ahead and dive in. So here we go. I will get it started. And we are talking about how to be a long-term thinker in a short-term world. So let's just do a quick refresher. You remember this. This was basically the visual representation of what 2020 actually was. We had so many nice intentions. I had nice intentions. I was going to be teaching in Moscow in April. I was taking a vacation in Egypt. I was going to be speaking at Amelia Island in Florida. That would have been nice. None of that, of course, happened for all of us, for our businesses, for our careers. We suddenly had to respond and react really quickly when everything changed overnight. This is actually probably this moment, this selfie is the moment when I realized that things were going a little bit nuts. You can actually see on here, Tuesday, March 3rd, 2020, I was giving a talk at Hunter College in New York City, where I live, and this event was it was going to be great. Like 150 people had registered. I'm so excited about this talk. And then all of a sudden, I think like maybe 20 showed up. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to take it personally. But that was the moment when people started to say, oh no, about all of this. People started to get really concerned about gathering in person, and all of a sudden, all of these RSVPs vanished overnight. I went down to teach at another university where I teach regularly, and I got to see my mom. She was totally ahead of the curve. She made this mask for me, so sweet. Nobody, of course, you recall, nobody had masks. Nobody knew how to do masks. My very talented mother taught herself how to sew masks by watching videos in Japanese and Chinese on YouTube. So props to mama for figuring that out. All of a sudden, we are thrown into a world of short-term thinking of necessity, right? We had to. That was the only way we could really realistically respond. All of a sudden, there's things we've never seen. There's social distancing. There's 6 foot lines. There's practically bread lines at grocery stores. There's FEMA trucks outside of the Javits Center in New York, where I live. So things were pretty alarming pretty fast. And we made do. And it was not easy. But for many of us, we were able to find a way through that. And in some cases, even really to thrive, surprisingly. But that is what consumed me as I was working on the long game. I literally got the contract for this book about long term thinking. I got word from my editor on February 28th, 2020, that they had accepted the book for publication. March 1st, the next day, was the first case of COVID in New York City. And so it was a little bit of a weird feeling to be writing a book about long term thinking in the midst of the most short term crisis, just in the need for us to be responding and be reactive that probably any of us has seen in our lifetime. But what I have really come to understand is that life is both a marathon and a sprint. It is not one or the other. There are times when we have to sprint, undoubtedly. There are times when we have to move forward really quickly, but you can't live your whole life like that, because if you do, you burn out and you don't necessarily end up where you want to go, because all we're doing is responding to the external. We have to set the direction. We have to reclaim it. No one's going to do it for us. And so this question of how to be a long-term thinker has really consumed me. How do we play the long game? So I did some research as I was looking into this question, and something astounded me. Maybe it will you too. So there was a study that was done a few years ago by an organization called the Management Research Group. It was a large study. They surveyed 10,000 executives and leaders. And what they discovered was there was almost unanimous agreement. 97% of the leaders that they surveyed agreed on one thing. They said that strategic thinking, long-term thinking, was crucial. It was the crucial factor in their organization's success. I mean, think about the last time that 97% of people agreed on anything, right? This is a big deal. But the other fascinating thing that they discovered is that, so 97% says, yes, this is the most important thing. What they discovered is that 96%, this is a separate study, but similarly a study of executives. In this separate study, 96% said they just didn't have time for strategic thinking. And maybe you found yourself in a very similar place, right? We know what we should be doing, and yet we are not doing it. And that disconnect is a huge problem. And we know lots of reasons why, but at a very basic level, in the book, The Long Game, I interview a colleague of mine named Jonathan Brill, who's a futurist and an author. And he said, I think this is quite powerful. If you have a lot of smart people together in a company, in an organization, the worst thing you can do, the number one mistake that you can make, is to tell these smart, driven people to win at the wrong thing. Because if you do, you actually can end up ironically losing by winning. Because if you are optimizing for something that is not the right goal, it can lead to really unfortunate consequences. And so fundamentally, when we are stuck in short-term thinking, when we are constantly just, heads down, focus, do the thing, and we don't actually take the time to lift our heads up again and say, well, wait, what should we be doing? Where are we heading? That can create unfortunate consequences. And the same thing is true. This is not just about companies, although it's certainly true for companies. It's true in our own lives. For many of us, we may have found ourselves, or certainly we all know friends and colleagues who are in situations where they have been so focused on attaining a goal. Maybe it's, oh, I'm going to make partner, or, oh, I'm going to do X. I'm going to launch this project. I'm going to do this thing. They're so hyper focused on getting it done, which is an admirable impulse. But if it is the wrong thing, you wake up at the end of it holding the thing in hand and it's not what you want at all. And that is not what I want for you. What I want for you, and the reason I wrote The Long Game, is because I want us to be optimizing for the right things. When we actually are playing the long game, when we are strategic thinkers, it enables us to take the pulse and to ensure that we are taking the steps today that are going to lead us in the direction that we want in 10 years, in 20 years, so that we can feel good about the choices that we make. People ask me sometimes, how do you define strategic thinking? How do you define long term thinking? And for me, it's really simple. It's just the question of, are we doing the things today, even if they're hard things, that will make tomorrow better, that will make it more likely that tomorrow looks the way we want it to? That's my hope for all of you. And so I wanted to share with you a series of strategies about how we can do that, some of the best thinking from the long game. And I hope that it might be useful. My goal really is to try to provide some frameworks that can hopefully illuminate things and maybe make it more likely for you that you'll end up in the destination that you want. So let's go ahead and dive in. And again, feel free to type your questions into the chat box because I want to make sure that we're tackling the things that are of interest to you, and we'll be taking Q&A at the end. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about, this is actually the first whole section, the first whole third of the long game, is the concept of white space and finding more white space. Here is something we all know to be true intellectually. You cannot pour more water into a glass that is already full. And a big problem for most of us in modern life is that our glass is already full. It is more than full. We are trying desperately, many of us, to put 120% of the activities into 100% of the time. Inevitably, we are going to feel stressed. Inevitably, we're going to feel behind because we are behind. And there's just structural limitations that we face. And so, what do we do with that? Well, it's not that it takes some huge amount of time to be a long term thinker. It doesn't, right? It's not about, oh, you need to have a retreat. Oh, you need to go on sabbatical. Those things are nice. That's great if you can, by all means. But for many of us, that's just not an option. But the good news is that it doesn't take that to be a long term thinker. It just requires a little time, and it requires more than anything. It requires mental space in order to do that. And so we have to find a way to begin to clear some of that mental space to make things a little bit easier for ourselves, so that we really can ask some of the deeper questions, the important questions that a lot of times just get shunted aside. So, what would that look like? One framework that I actually put forward in the long game that I hope might be helpful to you. This is something that, as you know, the good news, my book has been out a week now, just over a week. So I've been doing a lot of media and a lot of conversations. And it's interesting sometimes to hear about particular things that seem to really resonate with people. And something that I think people have been responding to a lot. So I wanted to make sure to share it with you is these 4 questions that I offer in the long game. And it's basically a checklist or a framework to help ask yourself, should I be doing this thing? Because a problem that a lot of us have, I mean, for obvious reasons, right? We feel bad sometimes saying no to people or saying no to opportunities. Sometimes it's because we just don't want to say no. We don't want to disappoint somebody. Sometimes it's because a piece of us is conflicted. We say, maybe that's a good thing. I don't know, right? But an almost universal truth that I think gets overlooked is that as we progress in our careers, we have to get tighter and tighter about the criteria that we use for saying yes to something. If you have just graduated, if you're 22, 23, yes is the right answer to almost anything because you don't know a lot of people. You're not getting a lot of invitations. You might not even necessarily know what you're interested in. And so doing things, meeting people is a great response. Hey, let's try it. Let's see. But as you get more advanced in your career, the number of queries advances, right? You're getting more invitations. You have more coming at you. And if you continue saying yes to everything, that will eventually crowd out anything proactive you're trying to do. And as a result, you can't really be a long-term thinker. You certainly can't be a long-term doer, because the things we get evaluated on in terms of promotions, in terms of our status at the company or in our industry, it's not answering emails and it's not taking meetings. It's about actually doing something, accomplishing a proactive project that you're driving. And so we need to protect the room for that. So how do we do it? Well, there's 4 questions that I hope can be helpful. So the first one I think is useful to ask. Again, we just have to take these implicit things and make them explicit. The first one is, what is the total commitment? And what I mean by this, we often in our heads, when we're agreeing to something in the moment, we may tend to minimize it a little bit. We say, oh, well, this person wants a coffee. Well, that can't be that long. Maybe that's 45 minutes. Maybe that's an hour. Well, maybe not. Because especially if you're traveling somewhere, if you're driving somewhere, oh, well, there's the travel time. Oh, there's a traffic jam. Oh, well, they're running late. All of a sudden, you say, oh, it's maybe 45 minutes. No, it suddenly turns into 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And that becomes a lot. If you say, oh, yeah, I'll do that free webinar for you. Well, that's great. Of course, it's true. It's only an hour, but there's the prep call. There's the other prep call. There's getting the slides ready. There's the practice tech check. There's all the things. May not be just an hour. It may be closer to 3 or 4 hours. So we have to understand fully what the commitment is so that we are making an informed decision if that's how we want to spend our time. Second question, what's the physical and emotional cost? We often overlook this. We often say, oh, I can do it. It fits on the calendar, so I'll do it. But for instance, if you are really busy or run down, if you've been traveling a ton, accepting an invitation for something, even if it might be a perfectly good thing to do at another time, may be pretty suboptimal because of the physical and emotional costs. So think that through. Third, this is really important. What is the opportunity cost? We often, when we're evaluating things, tend to almost look at it as like up or down, like, oh, should I do it? Should I not do it? That's often the wrong question. What we need to be thinking is, okay, should I do this? Or should I take that same amount of time, that 1 hour, that 3 hours, whatever it is, and do literally anything else in the world with that time? Because that's really what the question is about opportunity cost. Finally, time can often help us in this regard. Time can help us evaluate the importance of something. The question to ask is, if I didn't do this, would I feel bad in a year? For most things, they just fade away. Who cares in a year? You've forgotten about it. But if it's something that a year from now you'll be regretting, then it's important to really consider that. I mean, just as one example of all of this really got hammered home for me a few years ago because I got an invitation from a friend of mine. It sounded good. She was part of this organization and they wanted me to be their speaker at an event they were doing on a Caribbean island. It sounded so fun and so glamorous, and I would get to spend time with my friend. But I thought about it and there was something tugging at me that's saying, maybe I shouldn't do this. And it was because while I technically could fit it into my calendar, literally at that time, this is of course pre-COVID, I was traveling the week before, I was traveling the week after. I knew I was going to be so burned out from it that I couldn't properly enjoy it. And the biggest draw, honestly, was just the chance to hang out with my friend. But I realized she lives like 3 miles from me. Like, I mean, I hadn't seen her in a long time, but like, come on, Dorie. If you really want to, you can make a plan to see her in New York. So that's the important thing, is really making sure we're asking the right questions so that we can carve out the white space. That's the very first step in becoming a long-term thinker, is making the mental space necessary so that we can actually be making these thoughtful decisions. So that's number one. Number two that I wanted to share was thinking about your career portfolio. And here's what I mean by this. If you are investing, pretty much anybody who invests, if you know one thing about investing, it is that it is generally considered to be bad advice to put all of your money in one stock, right? You want to diversify. You want to make sure that you're protected by having your money in a lot of different things. And similarly, we don't necessarily think about it this way, but it's very, very similar with regard to our career. If we are all in on one thing, if that thing is going well, well, then congratulations, you're doing great. But if for some reason something changes, your industry changes, you're, maybe working in hospitality during COVID, or if there's something going on with your company, if there's layoffs, things can become really challenging and really frightening if you were all in on one thing and suddenly that vanishes. And so, one strategy that I talk about in the long game is 20% time. And you may be familiar with this concept from its corporate application. Google popularized it. Originally, it was a 3M innovation. They did it as 15% time. And then Google later adopted it as 20% time. And the idea is that employees are eligible to be able to spend up to 20% of their time on a more speculative project, a more experimental project that is outside of the normal scope of their activities. And this is how Google News was invented. This is how Gmail was invented. So it can really lead to some good outcomes. Um, of course, sometimes it leads to nothing. And that's the nature of the beast, right? But it's the point of an experiment is that you innovate and you see where it goes. Now, we know about it from an innovation point of view, but I want to say this is something that is incredibly valuable for all of us to think about in our own careers because we need the professional equivalent of cash, which is steady and stable, and also something like investing in SpaceX 20 years ago, right? Something totally speculative. Might go big, might go nowhere. But if you have tiny bets, maybe your 20% time, frankly, it could be 5% time or 10% time, depending on what is possible for you at this stage in your life and your other commitments. But investing just a little bit of time and energy in building your career portfolio and diversifying it is extraordinarily valuable. So, thinking about how do I protect my 10 or 20% of time to do things like take professional development courses or explore a new area or volunteer with a charitable organization so I can serve on the board and practice new skills. Any of these things that you are doing can be so powerful because it's giving you skills that you're cultivating on the side that you can then apply back to your regular day job, or it might even lay the groundwork for you for a future career direction, which is quite interesting and powerful. We don't If COVID taught us nothing else, it's that the world can change very rapidly in unexpected ways. And how do you prepare for that? Well, it's pretty hard to prepare for things that are super unexpected, but a good way to prepare is to make sure that with your 20% time you're diversifying enough so that you've new skills, new interests, new possibilities in your back pocket just in case, because we don't know what's happening. I'll give you my example. I really try to walk the talk. So I decided 5 years ago that I was going to create a 10-year goal for myself. And that goal was that I was starting from zero. I was going to learn how to write musicals, and I was going to create a musical that would make it to Broadway by the 2026 season. So it was a 10-year goal. And so now I write about this in the long game. I'm 5 years in. I'm halfway through this goal. Now, have I written a show that's made it to Broadway yet? No, I definitely haven't. Also, we'll handicap it a little bit because of COVID. But nonetheless, in 5 years, I have gone from having literally no idea in the world how to write a musical to having applied to, been accepted to, and completed one of the country's most prestigious musical theater training programs. It's a program run by BMI, the music publishing company. I've learned how to write musicals. I have written a complete musical. It has been accepted into an accelerator. Just last week, when my book came out at the same time, I feel so fortunate. I got accepted into another kind of fellowship program for musical theater. So I'm moving it forward. I'm not at Broadway yet, but I've been working my 20% time, and we can all do this. Whatever our thing is, maybe you want to become a better public speaker. Maybe you want to develop your knowledge in artificial intelligence, or some other area that you feel like is really going to be interesting. Maybe you want to build different soft skills you have, or get to be better at management or delegation, or maybe you want to learn to speak a different language. Any of those things can be extremely valuable, and it becomes part of your portfolio and part of your 20% time. So that's something that I think has been very helpful, and something that I talk about in the long game. The third category that I wanted to share is another concept I talk about in the book called heads up and heads down mode. And so this actually comes from an interview that I did. It's all a continued learning process. But my most recent book before The Long Game was this one. It was called Entrepreneurial You. And as I was researching this book, I interviewed a guy named Jared Kleinert, who's a cool guy. He's a young entrepreneur in Atlanta. And he was talking about how he thinks about his time. And he used this formulation of heads up and heads down mode. And I thought, oh, that's so useful. Because oftentimes in my executive coaching work or in the online course and community that I run, I sometimes talk to folks and they feel, maybe a little bit stuck, or they might be feeling a little bit down because they're like, I just feel like I'm in this rut. I'm not getting to where I want to go. I'm not making the progress I want to make. And very frequently, I see patterns in what is going on. And it turns out that oftentimes what is going on is that basically, and this is a very human tendency, right? I think we've probably all been here. They just kind of keep trying to do the same thing. They keep trying to do the same thing that they're good at, the same thing that they like doing, the same thing that they know has worked up to that point. And that is great. Like it's not bad. It's better than watching cat videos. But the problem is that oftentimes particular strategies only work up to a certain point. And so you need to know how to switch, how and when to switch what you're doing. And so what I think is useful about heads up and heads down mode at a really basic level, this is thinking through, when do we look for ideas and when do we execute them? We all need to get good at toggling between these two things. We can't just be doing one of them. Heads up mode is the time, it's a very kind of open, extroverted, experimental time, right? It's like, oh, heads up. Like I'm meeting people, I'm looking around, I'm seeing what's out there, I'm, finding cool ideas, I'm seeing what I want to do. It's very, sort of fast and inspiring. You're getting that vision. That's great. But of course, if you keep doing heads up mode, taken to an extreme, like a lot of things, it backfires, because too much heads up mode is like, oh, you got shiny object syndrome. You never get anything done because you never settle on anything. You just keep looking for the next thing. What you need to do is to toggle down. Once you make a decision, you need to toggle down into heads down mode, because that is the time when you execute, when you focus, when you say, you know what? I am willfully choosing to put my blinders on so that I am not distracted by other things. I am executing, I am doing things. Now, it's also true we can't do heads down mode forever, because if we do, while we're, burrowing like a beaver or whatever, do beavers burrow? Anyway, somebody does. Raccoons, some cute little animal, they burrow, and maybe it's groundhogs. Anyway, too much heads down, we are missing the external cues. We may be missing it when circumstances around us change, and therefore it renders our goal that we're working toward irrelevant or inappropriate. That's how we get the situation we talked about earlier, where you lose by winning. We definitely don't want that to happen. And so that's why you need heads down mode to get things done, but you also periodically need to lift your head up, just like these cute little Canadian geese, and ask yourself, okay, have circumstances changed? Am I still optimizing for the right thing? That's what we need to be asking ourselves, toggling between the two. Now, the fourth piece that I wanted to share with you, and I think this is an important part of the long game, especially, is, as I was writing this book, I was thinking a lot about the readers. I was, really in a lot of ways writing this. I dedicated it, in fact, to people who are part of my recognized expert online course and community, because, this is like 600 people that have been through the program that I've worked with. And so I've just seen so many broad swaths of people go through similar things. And it's very frustrating to me when good, smart people give up too soon on their best ideas. That is something I never want to see, because I really want to live in a world where the best people and the best ideas are the ones that win, not just the loudest voices. But it can become, understandably, very discouraging sometimes, because if you are working towards something that is a long-term goal, something meaningful, something important, I mean, first of all, it just often does take a long time. That's just a thing. But also, part of The challenge is that oftentimes at the outset, we don't we don't really know how it's supposed to go, quote unquote. And it becomes really, really hard in the moment to tell the difference between is it not working or is it not working yet? And that's a really big question. And so, something that I've found quite inspiring actually is the work of a couple of guys, Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler. They have written a couple of books, Bold and Abundance, notably among them, about what they call exponential technology. And exponential technology, as they define it, is the kind of tech advances in things like 3D printing or artificial intelligence or self driving cars, even digital photography, where the progress on it happens exponentially. And this is really interesting because what they point out is that there is something in exponential technology growth called the deception phase. This was my favorite part because I thought, oh, that's so true. It's so right. And that is in the very earliest stages of a technology, it really could be growing exponentially. It could be doubling, 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 right? But if you start out and it's small enough, nobody can tell the difference unless you are a very trained researcher or a super keen observer. Like the difference between zero point zero 0.02 and 0.04 and 0.08, it still looks like a big fat zero if you were looking really carefully. And so this is why for so long we often have situations where people hear about a technology, they read some articles or something and they say, oh, self-driving cars are coming. And then all of a sudden it's like, whatever, 5 years later. And it's like, hello, I thought they were supposed to come and they didn't. And so I guess that was all a bunch of, what? So you stop taking it seriously and you say, oh, I guess that failed. But then what happens is that, a few more years down the line, all of a sudden, whoa, something happens and everything changes. All of a sudden something clicks in. It's like, oh my goodness, that progress is going incredibly fast. Where did that come from? But the truth is, it's been growing exponentially all along. It's just that it was too tiny. It was too small for the human eye to notice before. We didn't pay attention. It's like a pond where, it's doubling, doubling, doubling. And one day, half the pond's covered in lily pads, and the next day it is completely covered, and everyone is amazed. And what I have discovered time and again, both in my own career and working with other professionals and coaching and consulting, is that for so many of us, we go through a deception phase as well, because on our path to progress in our careers, to getting that promotion or to winning those clients or to getting recognized and breaking in to a certain publication or getting our ideas heard, it can often feel like a very long and lonely journey. And it feels like no one's listening or we're just not getting anywhere. But that is the deception phase. And it can feel really discomforting because it's not just that they don't know, that the world doesn't know that we're making progress. Sometimes we can feel like we're not making progress. Like, hey, am I getting anywhere? I did a piece that came out last month for the Harvard Business Review, and it was talking about this question. It was based on the long game, talking about, what to do if you're feeling stuck or if you're feeling stymied in some way. And I tell the story. This is something that Professor David Galenson from the University of Chicago writes about. He's an economist who actually studies the art market. And he talks about the fact that, some people like Picasso was successful kind of right out of the gate. And so, yay for Picasso, that's really great. But other people that are recognized as equally good artists now, like, for instance, Cezanne, he was not recognized as someone who was worth looking at. Even into his mid 40s, he was not successful at all. He thought he was pretty close to a failure. And it was only later that he attained acclaim and that people really saw what he had to offer. So for all of us, we go through this deception phase and it can be disheartening. And this is the point where a lot of times people quit. And I would argue quit too soon before their ideas really get fully out there, before their worth is recognized. And so that's why I have a concept in the long game that I call looking for the raindrops. And what I mean by this is that it is so important for us so that we don't get prematurely discouraged to look for these small, tiny signs of progress. It is very much like a rainstorm, right? Before it starts raining, it's pretty rare that you would go from like totally clear skies to like all of a sudden, oh my gosh, there's a big rainstorm, right? That usually doesn't happen. Usually there are signs. Usually the storm clouds are gathering. Usually before the downpour starts, we've all experienced this, there's a few little stray raindrops. You can't even tell. You're like, was that a raindrop? Was that a thing? Was that just an air conditioner? You don't know. You almost feel like you're hallucinating because it's just small, it's tiny, it's easy to overlook it. But for all of us, progress is like that too. Progress is not likely to be an overnight, oh my gosh, you won the Nobel Prize, right? It's much more likely that you will see tiny, tiny signs you're moving in the right direction. And we have to recognize that consciously. It's easy to say, oh, well, that's not a big thing. That doesn't really matter. Oh, that's not a big deal. I wasn't invited to give a keynote. I was just invited to give a workshop. Who cares? Or, oh, that was, and yeah, somebody sent a note, but, that's not a big deal. Whatever it is, we need to really clue in. I mean, it could be something as small as just more people are starting to friend you on LinkedIn because they're starting to hear about you. And you might say, it's like 3 people a day. That's not a big deal. But it actually is a big deal because much like the growth before the big pop, when we're in the deception phase, it looks tiny. But if growth keeps happening, it shows that we are on the right track and that we're moving in the right direction. And that is incredibly valuable. So watching for those raindrops is so crucial so we can test and begin to see if we really are moving the right way. And that's what can keep us encouraged during those dark times in the tunnel when it just feels like, oh gosh, maybe this isn't working at all. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The last piece that I wanted to share was a question that I think can really help guide us. And I talk about this in the long game. We have to make sure that we are really focusing on the right things and optimizing for the right things. And something that I will posit as one possibility is the question ultimately, what kind of person do you want to be? And I'll give you an example of this. In the long game, I tell the story of a friend and colleague of mine named Alyssa Cohn. And Alyssa, probably like a lot of you, she got super obsessed a few years ago with Hamilton, the musical. She's really into it, loved it. And so when she heard that the creator, Lin-Manuel Miranda, had launched a new project, she was like, I want in. I want in on this somehow. So he had created something called Freestyle Love Supreme Academy. It's very cool. It is an actual training program that trains people in the art of improv, beatbox, hip hop, rap. Now, Alyssa was not necessarily a natural candidate for this, right? She was not really a rap fan. She had only even learned about rap through Hamilton, but she loved Lin-Manuel and she said, "Well, I want to try this thing that he helped create." So she signs up for her course and she gets in. She goes, this is a little bit pre-COVID, so they're doing it in person. And she signs up for this course. She gets there and it's her, and it's literally a room full of like 20-year-old guys in hoodies who are all expert rappers. And she thought, oh no, this is maybe not the right thing. This is maybe not the right move here. And she was a little intimidated. She said the first time they had an exercise that first day in class where they went around and they were supposed to rap gibberish as just like a warm up. And she couldn't even do that. She was like, pass. So she was so nervous. She emailed the instructor after the class and she said, I'm worried that this is not for me. I'm worried that this is the wrong kind of thing. And the instructor wrote her back. And his message was actually really powerful. He said, Alyssa, the goal is not to turn you into a rapper. The goal is to help you tap into your creativity and become a more uninhibited person. And she realized, oh, right, that actually is my goal too. Alyssa's an executive coach. She actually, believe it or not, does not want to be a professional rapper, but she does want to be more creative and she does want to be more uninhibited. And so she said, okay, this actually is what I should be doing. And so she, for 8 weeks, she went every week, went to this class, learned how to do it. She was super uncomfortable and super nervous, but she made it happen. And just before COVID shut everything down, one of the last things, literally in early March, was she did a performance that she invited all of her friends to. and she performed it, and she got so into it. She actually, this is a still taken from a video. She decided to make a rap video about executive coaching. It's up on YouTube. You can see it. And I love this. Her opening line is, yo, coming in hot with that rap charisma. I'm your executive coach, and my name is Alyssa. So she has mastered this because at a fundamental level, it's about what kind of person we want to be. If we can use that as our North Star, if we can be optimizing for that, that is the ultimate long-term strategy that can help guide us. And so, just as one more thought problem for all of us, a story that I tell in the long game actually comes from Jeff Bezos. In 2018, he wrote a shareholder letter for Amazon shareholders. And he tells a story about a friend of his who wanted to get good in yoga at doing handstands. And of course, I guess this is a very motivated friend. This friend hired a handstand coach for yoga. And the handstand coach apparently told her, most people, if you ask them to kind of guesstimate how long it would take them to learn how to do a handstand in yoga, they would probably say about 2 weeks. 2 weeks of practice can get you to be able to do an effective handstand. That is, it turns out, not true. The actual answer is that it takes 6 months of daily practice, daily, to become proficient at doing a yoga handstand. So for me, I thought this was so powerful because ultimately, these are smart people trying to make a good faith estimate of how long something's going to take. They say 2 weeks. It actually takes 6 months. That's 24 weeks. Most of us can appreciate. We say, oh, well, we're not sure. So, maybe my estimate's off by 10%, 20%, maybe even 30%. This is literally off. People specifically saying to themselves, how long would this take? They are off by a factor of 12x. Their estimate is off. And so much of life is like that too. We don't necessarily really think through our plans or ask the questions about how long something will take or what that road looks like. And when we don't, we can sometimes radically underestimate what is required. And so you can imagine if somebody thinks it's going to take 2 weeks to master a handstand, they've been doing it 2 months at this point, and they have no progress, they're probably going to quit. And they're probably going to feel very justified in giving up because they say, oh, well, I tried it. Apparently, it's just not for me. Apparently, I just can't do it. That's not true. It's just that it almost always takes for everyone way longer than you anticipated. I want good people and good ideas to succeed. That is the whole point of the long game, is that I want to live in a world where good ideas get heard and get developed. And a big part of it is making sure that we, really think about and understand what's necessary, and then we can work backwards from that. It's not that it's impossible to run a marathon, but it's impossible to run a marathon if we thought it was going to be a 5K and then we suddenly discover it's taking a lot longer and we get discouraged. So for all of you, I want your best ideas to be heard in the world and for you to succeed in putting them forward. And so for me, that's really what the long game is about. We're going to switch into questions momentarily, and I'm going to be turning it back over to our wonderful host. I'll just mention that for any of you who are interested in kind of applying this lens to yourself in your own life, I have a free self-assessment that you can get. You can download it for free at dorieclark.com/thelonggame and be able to sort of turn the lens on yourself and think through long-term thinking in your own life and career. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and let's have some of your questions because I want to hear what's on your mind.
Hey, Dorie. Yeah, that was great. I especially like the rapping. So that's
Who doesn't
pretty
like
cool.
the rapping? Seriously,
Yeah,
Julia.
I know. And that you wrote a musical, that's pretty cool as well. So a lot of hidden talent there. Yeah. So yeah, we have a lot of questions. So let's get to those. How about from Beth? Would you advocate for dated vision statements that push out the time horizon in strategic planning and or the bonus goal with a 10-year achievable in a strategic plan document?
Excellent. Well, Beth, I love, obviously you are a very methodical thinker, so I like that very much. So I would say if that's how your brain works, then amen, go for it. I will also say too that one of the things that I like best, kind of I feel like it's like the secret underappreciated element of true long-term thinking is that honestly, if you have a genuinely long-term vision, like let's call it a 10-year vision, you actually don't need to know how you're going to achieve it. Now, you might have some hypotheses, right? But the honest truth is that if it's 10 years away, a lot is going to change between now and then. And if it's something that's outside your normal realm, for me, like musical theater, like I really didn't know very much about it at the outset, you might really just not have a clue what it entails, but we should not let that limit us from creating that goal. The good news is that in 10 years, you have plenty of time to figure things out. And so, consequently, what I like to say is it's not that we need to create this super meticulous plan with, step A through, triple Z. Ultimately, we need to be directionally correct, right? And so, it's about thinking, I want to end up here. And then for now, what's the next best step? And if we keep taking the next best step, the thing that we can do now, the thing that we can control now, that's what enables us to continue marching forward. It's like driving through the fog. You can go 1,000 miles just, a few feet at a time. So I think that's part of it as well. But to your point, I'll also mention I actually tell a story in my most recent book before the long game called Entrepreneurial You. And I talk about a guy named Lenny Achon. And Lenny was really successful. I met him about a decade ago when I was doing consulting work for a big hospital system in New York. And he was the head of communications, only in his 30s. He'd had a very meteoric rise. And interestingly, I finally got to meet him. I'd been hearing about him a lot. I got to meet him and I asked him, I'm like, Lenny, how did you, come up so fast? And he told me, he said, oh, well, gosh, I just pre-wrote my resume. I was like, Lenny, what does that mean? Like, what are you talking about? And so what he explained, which I thought was fascinating, is he has a strategy where, you and I probably all update our resume every year, right? Give it a little polish. Oh, okay, I got this promotion or I'm doing this now. Lenny does that too. Every year he updates his resume. But the trick is, it's not his resume for this year. It's his resume for 5 years in the future. So right now, Lenny would be working on his 2026 resume. And what he does is he identifies the job or the title or the responsibilities he would like to have then. And the key, this is not like just wishing and hoping. What he does is he really drills down and he says, okay, if I want this position, here is what I would be doing. Here's what I would be required to do for that. And here are the jobs that I would need to hold or the training that I would need to get in between here and there so that I would be prepared for such a job. So he works backwards to create an action plan for himself so that he is ready for the opportunities that he most wants. So I think that can be quite powerful as well.
That's interesting. I never thought of it that way. Okay, great. Here's another question from Nilu. For the category of career portfolio, you alluded to the 20% being unrelated to our work. Is the idea to support context switching for neuroplasticity?
Oh, well, yes, it can totally do that. Although certainly in terms of my thinking about it, it's not necessarily specifically for neuroplasticity, but it can be very helpful. I mean, for those who are not familiar with the term, of course, neuroplasticity is about essentially just stretching your brain in new directions, moving your brain, which is plastic, movable in terms of learning new things, gaining new skills. It's like keeping your brain sharp. So yes, it absolutely does that. I would say in terms of its sort of real world results, really what I was thinking more about, in addition to your great point about neuroplasticity, is number one. It's really good for just us not being bored, like at a really basic level. How do we keep ourselves interested? How do we keep ourselves engaged? That is true whether you love your job and your job is amazing, or especially if you were in a position where it's like, I'm a little sick of this, but I need to keep doing it. I've got bills to pay. Well, give yourself just a little bit of space to do something fascinating and new for you. That's very powerful. But especially, I think it's valuable because the more skills that you are cultivating for yourself, it's basically just, more arrows in your quiver. You are better armed for the future, whatever that future looks like.
Okay, great. When you were giving us the 5 ways to become a long-term thinker, one of the ways was heads up, head down. Micah was asking us if you have any suggestions for balancing the heads up, heads down.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think, of course, this is a little bit more art than science, and we can adapt it based on your own unique circumstances. But in general, I would say we should probably be spending more time in heads down mode than heads up, right? Heads up is about just, getting all, taking in all of the things, all the wonders of the world. So let's meet people, let's get ideas, let's see what's going on. But again, up to the point where we identify something where it's like, yes, this is what I want to do. That is fantastic. It might take you a while sometimes, who knows? But once you find that thing, you need to execute on that thing, and it takes a while, of course, for you to be seeing results. Now, that's not to say that you become monomaniacal about it. Typically, what I advise when it comes to goal setting is that about every 6 months, I personally, and I think this is not a bad time frame for most people, about every 6 months, I revisit my goals just to stress test them, just to make sure that they are still the right goals for me. Have circumstances changed, or should I just keep plugging away? And so we can say, every 6 months, kind of, okay, poke your head up, ask yourself the question, take a look around. But I think in general, we probably need to spend proportionately a little bit more time in execution mode or heads down mode, just because the execution is the thing that really takes a lot of time.
Okay, good. We had a couple questions on two ends of the spectrum. One question about, do you have any suggestions for long-term thinking in teens? And then what about long-term thinking for people on the retired, maybe they don't have 10, 20, 30 years left to plans. What would you suggest for those?
Yeah, certainly. So if we're talking about, folks who are retirement or close to retirement, long-term thinking, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, long-term thinking is more a way of being than it is literally talking about, oh, it's X number of years and how do you plan for X number of years. Ultimately, again, if we can refer back to the definition, how do we take the steps that we need now to make tomorrow better? And tomorrow, it's it could literally be tomorrow, but really we're thinking, okay, a few months, of a few years, it could be any of those things. And so, just by way of example, I always feel like one aspect of this is something as simple as working out. Right? You are almost never going to regret the time that you spend exercising and keeping yourself healthy. Right? Like if you look back, I don't, unless of course you were an idiot and tried to work out too hard and like hurt yourself. Most people are not going to be like, wow, I really regret that time that I spent, at the gym keeping myself healthy, because it pays dividends later on. And so similarly, it's really just thinking, how can we orient our lives in such a way that we're heading toward the thing that we want to do? Maybe it's something like, okay, well, I know because I have more time now. If I'm retired, I want to be spending more time with family. So maybe that involves things like buying a vacation house near your relatives, or moving to be near your relatives, or scheduling a family vacation once or twice a year where everybody goes to Europe together, whatever that looks like. But that is a way of optimizing and sort of planning for the long term, meaning what is your ultimate goal? What is the thing that's important to you? Well, how are your day-to-day activities and the plans that you're making leading up to that? So I think that's a crucial way of doing it. If we're thinking about it, at the other end of the spectrum for kids, you're if you're thinking about teenagers and helping them make plans for everything. Again, I think that the most important thing that I could advise here is, and this is something that I talk about a lot in the long game. We often put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and I think this is really true, especially for young people, around the concept of find your passion. And it is wonderful to find your passion, and if you know what it is, then go for it. That's incredible. But a lot of people, a lot of teens, frankly, a lot of people don't necessarily have a sense of what is my passion in life, like what is the meaning of my life? And I think we really get hung up in it sometimes, because many times people say, well, gosh, if I don't know what my passion is, then I really can't do anything. I can't get started if I don't know what my passion is that I'm optimizing for. And I think that is really erroneous thinking and kind of harmful thinking, because the way that we learn about ourselves is by doing. You can't just like sit there and, stagnate and beat your head against a wall and say, what's my passion? What's my passion? You learn about your passion by optimizing for your interests, by optimizing for what you find interesting, and then learning and tweaking and saying, okay, well, this is really interesting to me. Oh, but this facet isn't. And you keep pivoting until you find something that appeals. And I think that's especially important for younger viewers, or if you're helping out your kids.
Great answer. I love that. Okay, so we have several people asking about building the steps to become a long-term thinker. And we're going to give a shout out to Chandler, who is seriously fangirling right now. Says it's pretty awesome to meet you virtually. He's been a fan for a while. What guidance can you offer about how to convert your brain to long-term thinking and planning?
Yes, yes, it's a big conversion in many ways that we have to do. But I would say if we are looking for a place to start, um, one of the mantras that I believe in that I think can be helpful is that creativity comes from constraints. And where a lot of us have gone wrong, frankly, is again just trying to shove too much into our days or too much into our lives and just being like, it's like, you put it all in a suitcase and you're like, wow, well, if I can find two really heavy guys to sit on it, then it'll work. And this is not a lasting strategy, right? We don't want our lives and our calendars to basically be like, oh, it'll work if we have two heavy guys sitting on it. No, that's not a good strategy. Instead, we need to bake in constraints. And I'll give you one example that I talk about in the long game. I have a friend named Dave Crenshaw who is a time management expert, and he talks about the importance at a really basic level of just setting an end time for your work every day. This is something where a lot of us have trouble, right? We can work until, especially during COVID, like until 10 o'clock at night, just doing things. And he says, look, if you want to have control over your schedule, you need control over your day. And so it's something as simple as just saying, look, I'm going to stop at this time. Now, don't go extreme, right? Like you have to sort of, train yourself for it. So if you've been working till 10 at night, you can't suddenly be like, well, I'm going to stop tomorrow at 5 and think that will work. That is not going to work. But what you can do is just every week ratchet it back by 15 minutes or something, right? Just practice. But as the constraints grow, you are going to have to get smarter and sharper about what you are delegating, what you are doing faster and improving the processes on, what you are just simply not choosing to do. And those decisions will make you more effective as a business person because you have to level up in accordance with those constraints. And that can help you become a better long-term thinker and give you the space to do it.
Okay, great. Danielle asks, how do you deal with the guilt of turning a really good person or a project down?
Oh, this is so hard. I know. I feel you, Danielle. I often have to deal with this as well, and we all do. As we sort of rise in our careers and more people know about us, or more people want to connect with us. Inevitably, you can't do it all. So, one thing that I actually will suggest. I mean, at a certain point, you do have to say no, but if there's something that you really feel conflicted about, one strategy that I like to share is find a way to quote unquote downgrade the request. And what I mean by this is oftentimes there's very standard ways that people ask to spend time with you. They say, "Oh, well, can we have a coffee? Can I buy you a meal? Or, can we have a call?" And if you are feeling mixed about it, I mean, if you want to do it, by all means, do it. But if you kind of don't want to do it, but you feel conflicted, you feel like you can't say no. What I like to suggest is say yes, but put your own parameters around it. And so, for instance, if somebody says, "Hey, Danielle, I want to pick your brain? Can I take you out to lunch?" What you could say, which I think is a perfectly good thing, you could still say yes to them. But instead of accepting their framing of the issue, say, "Oh, wow, I'd really love to be helpful. If you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them. My schedule is crazy right now, so I can't do a lunch. But how about we set up a call?" And just even that, right? The difference between the 2 hours that a lunch could take between the actual lunch and transit versus a tight 30-minute phone call, you have just bought yourself back 90 minutes. And if you keep doing that consistently, it becomes really powerful for your schedule and you're able to save a lot of time.
Okay, great. One last question. You mentioned that, that COVID that threw us into that mindset of short-term thinking. and it just happened to play into like the timing of your book. What made you think about the subject of this book, and what inspired you to write the book?
Yes. Well, even pre-COVID, which like a lot of people, I shockingly did not predict that this would happen. I've been thinking about long-term thinking for a while because, at the business level, at the enterprise level, I think, most of us have seen that the pressure for the short term, the short-term earnings has often distorted a lot of business practices, that companies are making some not great choices. You hear about corporate malfeasance. Almost all of it, when you do hear about it, is about oh, we had to look good. We had to keep the share price up on the quarterly earnings. And it really ends up distorting things in very negative ways. And then similarly in our own lives, social media is constantly present, and a lot of people have just fallen into the understandable trap of comparing themselves to other people, sort of tracking their progress against other people, and sometimes feeling like, oh my gosh, what am I doing wrong? I am not measuring up. What do they know that I don't know? And of course, it's not really helpful to constantly be second guessing ourselves. And so again, because my goal is to have the best people win, the best ideas win, I really wanted to try to help people find a way to cut through that, to cut through the noise, so that they can find the signal and be able to, pursue their own path, run their own race, and be able to get great things done.
Wonderful. Well, Dorie, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. And the link to Dorie's book is right below the video, along with the link to her workbook. Yes, The Long Game, you can get that there. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, do you have a Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, anything like that?
Yeah, thank you so much. Absolutely. Folks can come to my website. You can send me a message through there. I have more than 700 free articles there that you can check out too. It's just DorieClark.com. And that's probably the easiest way to get me.
Beautiful. Okay, and there's also a survey that you can fill out for this webinar. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Dorie, for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you, everyone.